In 1909, an old house situated next to the gates of Greenside Cemetery in the Kirkgate in Alloa became the focus of some strange goings-on. The graveyard was reputedly haunted, and it was said that there were tunnels there which allowed ghosts to travel between this world and the other world. But many in the town didn't believe in ghosts until that September, and groups of people flocked to the cemetery to have a look, just in case they saw the phenomenon. Mrs. Gillis and her family lived at the property, and from early September she'd heard strange noises, although claimed she never saw any ghosts. She said she'd heard tappings and low moanings coming from the corner of one of the rooms, and that this happened between midnight and 2 or 3 in the morning. To her, they appeared to be speaking in a foreign language as she couldn't understand them. All her family heard the sounds, which resembled the low moans of a person suffering in some way. But they were not the only ones to hear them. People passing outside the house also claimed to have heard them, which backed up her claims, as did a friend of her son's. A young man called Watson had been playing dominoes with James Gillis, Mrs. Gillis' son, in the kitchen, when they suddenly became aware of tapping noises, and it sounded as though 2 people were talking. Again, he claimed, they were speaking in a foreign language which he couldn't understand, but it seemed to come in short bursts, rather than a long conversation, with many pauses in between. He went on to say he'd never had such a fright in all his life. In all, he counted up to 30 mini-conversations, but at that point stopped as the pair seemed to begin singing or humming in tune. The story appeared in the Alloa Advertiser newspaper, and shortly afterwards, a respected spiritualist from Glasgow read it with interest and decided he wanted to come through to the town and investigate. It wasn't the first time his services had seen him banish spirits from people's homes, and he was confident he could do the same in Alloa. On the evening of Wednesday 22nd September, he arrived at Mrs. Gillis's house and asked her permission to carry out an investigation. He began by collecting all the information he could about the disturbances from the family and Mr. Watson. He also spoke to the sexton, Mr. Gow, who told him about the graveyard and its history, and how he thought the story was nonsense. He was then shown where the noises had been coming from. In the early hours of the Thursday morning, he entered the haunted room alone. He sat on a chair near the window, facing the corner where the strange sounds had been coming from. Staying in the kitchen were the Gillis family, where they waited quietly while the medium conducted his work. Shortly afterwards, they heard him call out, "Come forth, come forth," but they heard nothing else. Once he was done, the spiritualist entered the kitchen and spoke to the family. He told them he'd seen 2 men who'd risen up through the floor simultaneously, carrying 2 torches. They appeared to him to be seafarers, as they were wearing, according to him, deep-sea outfits. One of them, he thought, was about 36 years old with a moustache and of good appearance, while the other had a beard, and he estimated him to be around 42. He continued that when they'd appeared, they'd begun to wrestle one another, with the young man eventually winning the tussle by throwing the older one to the floor. He then stood over him, laughing heartily. On this occasion, neither seaman spoke, so the medium couldn't tell if these had been the 2 men that had been the cause of the noises that Mrs. Gillis and her family had heard. He assured Mrs. Gillis that these 2 spirits wouldn't be bothering her again, and that she should use the room as much as possible and not to be afraid when she did so. As he said, fear was the devil. As he left, he told her to get in touch with him if anything else should occur, and that he would come back and visit the house. But he believed that she would never have to write to him again. If she did write, he hoped the message would read, "No noise." In the early hours of the Saturday morning, the noises returned to the house when the family were alone. The clock at the tower of Old St Mungo's Church in the graveyard had just struck 5, when it had started all over again. By this time, Mrs. Gillis was at her wits' end. She'd heard the voices speaking and thought the kitchen was going to fall down. She reeled round and was fair frighted by what was happening. She felt so strongly about it that she would have to leave the property, as she simply couldn't stay. As news spread, many locals wanted to spend time in the haunted house to see the spectre or spectres for themselves. But one man who encountered them was terrified out of his wits. He and others had been sitting quietly when the door of the room opened slowly, as if in a cautious manner. That was it. The man's hair stood up, his hat fell off, and he scarpered, and he would not go back, for a fiver, as he put it. He was later told by one of the group that another man had lifted a poker, but dropped it when he saw a man, glowing, coming right through the table, and fainted. When asked if the family really believed they had a ghost and that it was not really just nocturnal animals or rats, they refuted the idea. They were completely convinced it was ghosts. Soon, local businesses seized the opportunity to make some money from the Alloa ghosts. Postcards of the haunted house were printed, including the so-called ghost itself, and adverts appeared, asking people to come to Alloa to see it. Even a song was written about it. The mysterious and frightening goings-on in the house disappeared after a short time, and were never heard again. But Mrs. Gillis remained vigilant and kept the address of the spiritualist close to hand, just in case. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.